The house was silent, the soft glow of streetlights outside casting faint shadows across the room. She walked quietly down the hallway, her heart racing as she approached the guest room. It was late, far too late for anyone to be awake, but she couldn't sleep. Not tonight, not with him here. Her son-in-law. A forbidden thrill washed over her, recalling all the moments, small, fleeting, but impossible to forget, that had brought her to this point. There was the first time she caught him watching her across the dinner table, his gaze lingering just a second too long, or the late-night conversations they'd shared on the porch while everyone else was asleep. His laughter, deep and effortless, would echo in the quiet, and she'd feel herself drawn in, sensing something in him that went beyond politeness, something he tried to hide. She had ignored those moments, brushing them off as harmless or unintentional, but now, standing outside his door in the silent house, she couldn't deny the truth. This was more than just a passing curiosity. The thought sent a shiver through her, a wave of heat rushing over her at the forbidden nature of it all. She knew she shouldn't be doing this, knew she should go back to her bed and let these thoughts go. But she couldn't help herself. She just needed to see him. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob, her breath catching in her throat. He was probably asleep, exhausted from the long drive. Every rational part of her mind told her to turn back, to go to her own room. But she ignored it, slowly turning the knob and opening the door just a crack. He lay on his back, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Moonlight streamed across his face, highlighting the strong lines of his jaw and the unruly mess of his dark hair. He looked peaceful, vulnerable, and something in her tightened painfully at the sight. She knew she shouldn't be here, but here she was. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she slipped inside, closing the door softly behind her. The floor creaked slightly beneath her feet, but he didn't stir. Slowly, cautiously, she moved closer until she was standing beside the bed, her heart pounding as her eyes traced over him, taking in every detail. The broad shoulders, the strong arms, the way his shirt had ridden up slightly, revealing a sliver of tanned skin. She bit her lip, pulse quickening as a wild, reckless urge took over. Without thinking, she reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his arm. Her hand hovered over his arm, and she could almost feel the warmth radiating from him, the kind of comforting heat that filled the space between them. Her fingers brushed his skin softly, the barest touch, yet it felt as if her entire body had tuned to that single point of contact. She could feel the steady rise and fall of his chest, and the faint rhythm of his heartbeat seemed to echo in her own. He shifted slightly, his brow furrowing, but he didn't wake. Emboldened, she let her fingers trail lower, skimming over the curve of his bicep, feeling the solid muscle beneath. He was beautiful, and completely, utterly off limits. Her hand trembled slightly as she let it drift lower, brushing lightly against his chest. His skin was warm beneath her touch, his heartbeat strong and steady under her palm. She felt a painful longing rise within her, one she had tried so hard to suppress. But it was impossible to ignore now. Biting her lip, she leaned down, her hair creating a curtain around them, and pressed her lips softly to his forehead. He murmured something in his sleep, his brow furrowing, and she froze, her breath catching. But he didn't wake, not yet. Her heart racing, she let her lips drift lower, brushing softly against his cheek, then down to the corner of his mouth. A soft, shaky breath escaped her as she hesitated, her gaze flickering over his face. This was wrong, so wrong, but God, she wanted it. Before she could second-guess herself, she leaned down and pressed her lips to his. As she leaned down, her hair formed a curtain around them, blocking out the world beyond the dim moonlight in the room. Her lips met his in a light, delicate touch, just a whisper of warmth that sent a thrill down her spine. She could feel his warm breath, soft against her face, mingling with her own. The faint scent of him soaked the cool night air, filled her senses, grounding her in this impossibly fragile moment. It was a light, fleeting touch, barely there, but it sent a rush of heat through her, her pulse pounding in her ears. He stirred again, letting out a low, sleepy murmur, his eyes fluttering open, hazy and confused. For a moment he simply stared at her, his gaze shifting between shock and something else, something dark and intense. "Mother-in-law," he whispered, his voice rough with sleep, low and husky, sending a shiver down her spine. His gaze searched hers, a mix of confusion and disbelief. "What are you doing?" I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. Yet she didn't pull away, couldn't. I couldn't sleep." "You shouldn't be here," he murmured, his brow furrowing slightly. But he didn't move. His hands remained at his sides, his gaze locked on hers. Her breath caught as she saw the look in his eyes. She should turn around, apologize, walk away. But instead, she stayed frozen, struggling to push back the surge of emotions that had taken her by surprise tonight. "Why can't I let this go?" she thought, feeling the weight of every moment they'd shared building to this. "Why does it feel like he's the one person who truly sees me?" "I know," she breathed, her fingers trembling slightly as she brushed them lightly against his chest. "But I can't help it." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The air between them felt thick, charged with something electric, something entirely forbidden. Then slowly, cautiously, his hand lifted, his fingers brushing gently against her cheek. "What are you doing?" he asked again, his voice softer this time, but no less intense. Her heart hammered in response, and she found herself leaning into his touch, giving in to the pull she'd been fighting against. She knew how wrong this was, that this line should never be crossed. But his touch, gentle yet questioning, felt like something she'd been waiting for without even realizing it. "I've held back for so long, and I can't do it anymore." "I don't know," she whispered, leaning into his touch. Her heart raced, her pulse pounding so hard it felt as if it might burst from her chest. "But I want you." He drew in a sharp breath, his face a mix of shock and something darker, something unspoken. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The pull between them, impossible to hide behind formality or duty. A small voice in his mind begged him to stop, to pull back before it went too far. But he felt himself falter, feeling her so close. "How did we end up here?" he thought, his pulse racing with a mix of dread and desire. "Why does it feel like I've waited my whole life for this?" He inhaled sharply, his gaze darkening, and for a moment, she thought he might push her away. Then with a low, frustrated growl, he pulled her close, his mouth meeting hers in a kiss that left her breathless. It was intense, filled with a longing that left her gasping, her hands tangling in his hair. His body pressed against hers, warm and solid, unyielding. "You know we shouldn't be doing this," he murmured against her lips, his breath hot and unsteady. "Please," she whispered, pressing closer, her fingers clutching at his shirt. "Please, I need you." He groaned softly, his lips tracing down her neck. She gasped as his hands roamed, his touch igniting a longing that matched her own. "Tell me you want this," he murmured, his voice low and rough. "Tell me you want me." "I want you," she breathed, her fingers tightening in his hair. "I want you so much." With a low guttural sound, he kissed her again, his hands gripping her, pulling her closer. His touch was everywhere, sending waves of anticipation through her. She felt herself arch toward him instinctively, her body drawn to his. "You're going to be the end of me," he murmured, his lips brushing lightly against her ear. "You know that." I don't care, she whispered, her fingers tracing his back, feeling the lines of his muscles. I just want you. For a long, breathless moment, they simply looked at each other, the world around them fading. Then his hands slid down, tugging at the hem of her shirt, pulling it up and setting it aside. God, he breathed, his gaze intense as he looked at her. You're beautiful. Heat flooded her cheeks, and she bit her lip, her pulse racing. You're perfect, he murmured fiercely, his hands cupping her face, his lips brushing softly against hers. And then he was kissing her again, his hands exploring, learning what made her gasp, what made her shiver. She felt herself relax under his touch, her mind spinning with the intensity of it all. I need you, she whimpered, her nails digging lightly into his shoulders. Please, I need you. I know, he murmured, his breath hot against her skin. His hands slid lower, skimming over her stomach, his fingers brushing lightly against her thigh. And I'm going to give you exactly what you need, baby. Just be patient. He held her close, and she felt the weight of him, solid and reassuring, pressing her gently into the mattress. His touch left a trail of warmth against her skin, igniting every nerve with a blend of tenderness and intensity. She could hear the sound of his breathing, now faster, deeper, as if each breath was a struggle to stay in control. The quiet of the house seemed to close around them, amplifying each soft sound, every whispered breath, every gentle murmur. Her hands clutched at his shoulders, her nails pressing in as he teased her with feather-light touches, making her squirm beneath him. I've wanted this for so long, he whispered, his lips brushing lightly against her ear. Wanted to feel you like this, to taste you. His words sent a shiver down her spine, a wave of heat washing over her. She gasped softly, her eyes fluttering shut as he leaned down, pressing soft, open-mouthed kisses along her neck. His mouth was warm against her skin, and she whimpered, her body instinctively arching toward him. Please, she whispered, her voice breathless and desperate. Please don't stop. A low, rumbling chuckle escaped him, the sound vibrating against her skin. Oh, I'm not going to stop, he promised, his hands sliding down to grip her hips, pinning her gently in place. Not until you're begging for me. His words sent a rush of heat through her, and she moaned softly, her fingers tightening in his hair. His lips traveled lower, along her collarbone, his hands slipping beneath the waistband of her pajamas. Her breath caught as he eased them down, his fingers skimming over the bare skin of her thighs. You're so soft, he murmured, his voice thick with desire. So perfect, she whimpered, her body trembling as he leaned down, pressing his lips softly against her stomach. His hands held her gently, his touch steady and warm. Don't tease me, she breathed, her voice trembling. Please. Shoo, he murmured softly, his lips brushing lightly against her inner thigh. I know, sweetheart, just let me take care of you. And then, he kissed her again, with a slow, careful intensity that left her breathless. She cried out softly, her back arching, her fingers twisting in the sheets as he continued, exploring her with unhurried dedication. Oh God, she whimpered, her body arching as her need built, desperate for more. He growled softly, his hands holding her close, and then he moved, covering her with his embrace, his lips capturing hers in a kiss filled with fervor and hunger. His hands cupped her face, his kiss deep and full of longing, as if he couldn't get enough. You're going to drive me insane, he murmured against her lips, his voice rough and strained. Do you know that? I want to, she whispered, her hands sliding down his back, her nails tracing gently along his skin. I want you to lose control, please. Her words made his breath hitch, his gaze darkening. For a moment, he just looked at her, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Then with a low, frustrated sound, he buried his face in her neck, his hands tangling in her hair. "You have no idea what you're doing to me," he murmured roughly, his lips brushing lightly against her ear. "No idea how much I want you." "Then take me," she whispered, arching up against him. "Please. I need you." With a soft curse, he crushed his mouth to hers, his kiss fierce and demanding. His hands slid down to grip her hips, shifting closer until she gasped, her body trembling as he settled against her. His weight pressed her gently into the mattress. "Tell me you want this," he demanded, his voice rough. "Tell me you want me." "I want you," she breathed, her fingers digging into his back. "I want you so much." A low growl rumbled in his chest as he kissed her again, his hands sliding up to cup her face, his fingers tangling in her hair. His mouth moved against hers, hot and hungry, and she melted beneath him, her body trembling, her mind spinning with the intensity of it all. His hands traced the curves of her body, and she whimpered softly, her back arching as his touch brushed lightly over her skin. He explored her slowly, deliberately, learning what made her gasp, what made her shiver. She lay beneath him, her heart pounding, her breath shallow, needing more, needing everything. "Please," she whimpered, her voice barely a breath. "Please. I need you." "Not yet," he murmured softly, his lips trailing down her neck, his hands sliding lower to hold her hips. "Not until you're begging for me." She bit back a frustrated sigh, her fingers twisting in his hair as he kissed his way down, his touch everywhere, teasing, tantalizing, driving her nearly out of her mind with want. Her breath quickened, her body instinctively arching toward him. "Please," she whispered again, her voice trembling. "Please. I'm begging you." He growled softly, his hands tightening slightly as he held her close. His mouth moved against her skin, warm and unrelenting, and she let out a soft gasp, her hands clutching at his shoulders, her whole body trembling at every touch, every kiss, every moment. And finally he gave her exactly what she needed. For the rest of the night, they moved together in a dance of longing and desire, their breaths mingling, their bodies close, completely lost in each other. They shared hours of soft whispers, gentle touches, and all-consuming warmth. When the first light of dawn crept through the window, they were still wrapped in each other's arms, their hearts beating together. As the first light of dawn crept through the window, a soft golden glow washed over them, casting gentle shadows and highlighting the lines of his face, his hands still resting on hers. The cool morning air filled the room, bringing with it a bittersweet reminder of reality. She could feel his warmth beside her, a comforting presence that lingered even as the world outside began to wake. For this brief, stolen moment, everything felt right, as though the entire world had shrunk to just the two of them. It was wrong. It was forbidden. But as they lay there, holding each other close, it felt, in that fleeting moment, like the most natural thing in the world.